We are now.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Okay.
Recording in progress.
Good. Good morning. Thank you all for your time this morning. I'd like to call the Audit Committee meeting to order, please, for January 25th, 10 a.m. in the City Hall. If we could take a roll call, please.
Hawk Furman.
Hawk Furman present.
Suzanne Woodland, Deputy City Manager, here for Karen Kennard.
Jesse Lynch.
Councilor John Tabor.
Councilor Kate Cook.
And Chair Chris White. Thank you. So I'd like to get the minutes from December 30 approved, please. If I could get a motion to that effect. Mr. Furman or Mr. Lynch?
I will make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you.
Second.
Is there any discussion?
I'll have to abstain because I wasn't here.
Yes,
And likewise.
I understand. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you. So, at the top of the agenda is welcoming our new members. Welcome. Councilor Tabor, I'm just, would you like to say a few words in terms of why you're here and what interest you have in audits?
There's some business I'd like to take up with the committee.
Okay.
I asked Mr. White for the charter that you created for yourselves. And I think we need a discussion of the charter and how it aligns with the ordinance that created the committee. It's very important, I think, that the committee do the scope of work that the council ordained when it passed the ordinance and stick to that task. I was part of the debate. There was a very broad initial writing of the ordinance with oversight powers over all of the city's finances. And over the process of 2 months, that language was removed and replacement language gave this committee the assignment to recommend to the council an auditor. And when I read the charter, I saw a large number of areas that went beyond that. So why is that important? Well, as Chairman White said, the City Council in the auditing process, we all have our handbook from Government Finance Officers Association, is the parent. By charter, the council selects the auditor and the auditor reports to the council. My concern is if the audit committee begins to engage beyond recommending an auditor into the audit itself, the auditor is going to say, to whom do I report? And we can end up with an auditor parent shopping. And this has been my concern with the audit committee all along. The question I think we need to answer is how much of the city council's authority over the audit did we delegate and how much did we not delegate? I think it's essential that we clarify that before we go further.
Thank you. Counselor Cook, do you want to introduce yourself and please?
Again, Counselor Kate Cook. I am here because I am generally interested in finances and audits, and I do have some background in that area. But I also, honestly, I also share the concerns of Counselor Tabor. I do a lot of review of ordinances and policies and rules, and I'm very confused by the charter of the committee as it compares to the ordinance for the audit committee. And so I do have questions around that as well. I also have questions around reporting authority, which was raised in December, I believe. There was mention of reporting to the state, which I find very unusual because my understanding of the ordinance was that the committee reports to the city council. I don't know that the city council gave this committee the authority to report to the state. My understanding is that our only committees that do not report directly to the city council are our land use boards that are established by RSA, and this committee is not established by RSA. So I do have questions around that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. What I would like to do is to explore these concerns under other business at the end of the meeting, if that's acceptable to you. So if we could, well, let me see. I failed to put in a session on public comment, and so I don't know. I believe that Esther Kennedy was going to join us by Zoom, but I don't see that she's here. So, Petra, would you care to make any sort of public comments at this stage?
Not at this stage. I can wait till you're all finished with your business.
Okay, all right. Thank you. So let's move on to the purchasing manual matter that I have in the agenda. And this will actually touch on a topic that will arise a little bit later in the agenda. But and this pertains to the 12/15/21 meeting where the audit committee had developed its RFP, and then the city substituted that for its own RFP. And in doing that, we were informed that Melanson would take over the role of doing the non-attest services, independent of any sort of RFP process. And our concern then was that violated the purchasing process as we understood it. Because what I had understood was that the non-attest services cost estimate would be over $10,000. And that if such services are retained by the city, that those, and it was estimated to be more than $10,000, then that required an RFP process. As we have looked further at this matter, it also appears as if federal regulations have a similar cutoff. at $10,000 and above. So we're wanting to gain further clarification regarding this issue from the city to determine if the city or federal regulations or procedures are being violated in hiring Melanson without a formal RFP process. So I'm wondering if Attorney Woodland would like to speak with that.
I'm happy to start this conversation. As I explained back at the December meeting, the city's policies and the ordinance which governs our procedure, our procurement process, allows for the engagement of professional services, of which the type of services that we're talking about here, which is basically the accounting type services for this work, it is not required for us to go out for bid or proposals. That being said, we often do, but there are exceptions to that. For example, when we have existing vendors that are performing, it is not uncommon for us to continue to reach new contracts for that continued performance, particularly if it's very much along the same lines of what they have already been doing successfully. And that happens within the engineering field. It happens within the legal field. You don't always go out and hire new counsel every year. So it is a case-by-case basis, and obviously when we go out, for example, a new construction project, it is very common that we will go out for requests for proposals to engage a new engineering firm because it's very project-specific, and it's a new project, and it's easy to bring someone on board, and we'll go through a very rigorous process of proposals. But in this case, it was not logical to do so, and there are very good reasons for continuing with the existing firm for at least those non-attest services as a point of stability, particularly if we're going to be getting a different firm for the audit itself. So we're very comfortable with our process. There are no federal requirements there that would limit us from doing the process that we undertook, and I'll just kind of say we're confident in the process. We do this pretty regularly, but that's not to mean that we wouldn't in the future, depending on how things evolve in the next couple of years, go out for an RFP for some additional services. But given where we were right now and the possible change to a different auditing firm, it seemed wise and in the best interest of the city to continue with the current firm that's doing the financial statements.
Can I just get some clarification? The non-attest services are essentially creating the PAFR and the CAFR?
No, the non-attest services are done to prepare the working budget papers of the city, converting them from cash or modified cash basis accounting to accrual accounting.
Yeah.
In doing so, there's, and it's the, it's those statements which are then audited by the auditor. So it's an important interim process of preparing the working papers of the city.
Has that always been, well, we've had Melanson for more than 20 years. Is it possible to have one vendor do the non-attest and another the audit, or do they have to, is it more sensible to recommend to the council that one firm do both?
So the so-called Yellow Book, which is an accounting guidelines book, suggests that in fact they be separate, and that only under certain situations where you can appoint someone to represent that the city's papers are done in accordance with various accounting principles, do they permit the same firm to be doing both services. But But in reality, when you know, it's a cautionary note. If you think about it, the entity that's preparing the non-attest services really should not be auditing its own work, which is in effect what has been happening for all these years. So it's best if it's kept separate. But in practice, it's not unusual to have the same entity doing that, but it requires that there be representation that the papers are prepared in accordance with all the accounting principles.
I also have a clarifying question around the RFP process. I'm a little confused about comments about the RFP of the committee being replaced with the RFP for the city. What is the standard practice for issuing RFPs for the city of Portsmouth?
Yep.
Let me just clarify first, the Melanson does also assist with portions of the PAFR and the CAFR as well as doing exactly those other pieces that Chairman White explained in terms of that piece. And then the city, under both the charter and the ordinances, the city as organization is responsible for doing all purchasing. So that's why we felt it was important in our role, in the city role, management role, to issue an RFP that we found would be in the best interest of the city of Portsmouth. But we did take into account many of the suggestions that we heard here. So we actually adopted many of the suggestions, which included separating out the non-attest services so that the city council would have the option to decide how they would like to go, and if they want to keep those separate, which I know the chairman would prefer, that the city council would have the option to do so, or could go back to as it's been done in the past years, which is the same firm, generally for cost efficiency and for staff efficiency reasons, is done throughout New England, as you heard at the work session. So we tried to take into account the some of the suggestions and concerns that were raised and incorporate them into the RFP, but there were certain pieces that we did strip out of the draft that the chairman and some members of the committee had wanted in terms of the role of the audit committee in the ongoing audit process. So, but it is our responsibility to make sure that we put the RFP out, and we have done so. And we did also take a list of audit firms that was provided by the chair, and we made sure that they received notice of the RFP along with another list that we had. So we combined them to make sure we got hopefully, we'll see what we get for proposals. So.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, where are we in that non-test services completion process? Has that been, where are we there? And then who have we heard back from, if anybody, on the RFP?
Sure. Is it okay if I answer? Sure. So I have a proposal from Melanson for the non-attest services and the services related to, assisting with the CAFR and well, it's not that anymore, it's the ACFR and the PAFR, which I have not had a chance to review yet. So it is a draft contract that we're looking at right now. And then with regard to proposals, we did hear from one firm that had some questions. And so we have responded to those questions, and they are issued, when we get questions, they become a formal addendum. So it's up on the website with the RFP so that all firms have the same answers. So we know some firms have seen it. So we'll just have to, we'll wait for the fourth. So.
Right, or third.
Or third, yeah.
If I may,
And just to clarify, if I may, those are due by the 2nd?
the third.
The 3rd?
Yep.
So we should be hearing from them.
Right. I just add to this conversation that in my discussions this fall with various auditing firms in Massachusetts, this provision of having the non-attest services be done by the same firm that does the audit is something which is subject to change. Sometime GASB as well as FASB issues proclamations periodically updating regulations pertaining to accounting. Well, the same happens with the auditing services. And so the auditing governing structures are looking at tightening up the requirements around those roles and separating out the non-attest services from the auditing services. Part of my reason why I would prefer that they be done by two separate firms is to try to get ahead of that process that may or may not occur for the next couple of years, but if we see that coming down the road, then why not respond accordingly and try to develop a system whereby it's done by separate firms.
And
Yep.
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing is a maiden voyage of a committee that we're trying to figure out as we go along how to make this work successfully.
Mhm.
I am concerned with one governance aspect, that in the city manager form of government, the city manager, the council is the policy-making arm, but we have this one little responsibility in the charter for the audit. That's a procedural, practical matter. But Attorney Woodland, have we ever had a committee tell city staff what should be in an RFP? Isn't that the purview of the city manager and her staff?
So it is ultimately the purview of the city manager and the finance department to issue an RFP and to decide on final language. That stated, we certainly have at times, had different committees, sort of give some direction and input, and that's how I took the efforts of this fall, which is there was some direction, some suggestions, some input, and then we used our final and best judgment in terms of the product to actually put out for advertisement. So, there's certainly been cases where we have taken input from various committees, I think, generally in more project-related situations. There's a special project, and or if we're going to work on doing an RFP for a master plan, it might have arisen from some conversations. So yes, we do take input, but it's the final authority kind of rests with the city to decide what the management thinks is in the best interest of the city.
Right, because one of the strengths of the city manager form of government is the elected officials can't try to tilt the RFP one way or the other. The city manager form of government gives the strong executive authority to the city manager to do that so that it's impartial and professional. So
And-
there's some tension here
Yes.
that
And-
we have to work through.
And I would say, that's why the proposals come in sealed and they don't get opened, until the process is complete. So there are a whole set of safeguards. And that, for example, when we get the questions that come in from proposers, you issue the addendum and make sure everyone, has the opportunity to see those answers so that people aren't getting different answers. It's trying to protect the integrity of the process. So there are those pieces that come out of it. And just for clarification, and the reason why the proposal from Melanson is still on my desk and has not yet risen to the priority level is that a lot of those non-attest services don't actually get done until October, to the fall, those pieces. So, so there's,
We're really working on fiscal year '22,
Yeah,
which is a June 30 year.
yeah.
So-
End date.
Right. I had another thought, Counselor Tabor, but it has flown the coop. I'm sorry.
You did have a thought related to that
Yeah.
Yeah.
point, which is a good one, but this ordinance specifically says, even the stripped-down, narrower version, that the city council and audit committee are responsible for auditor selection. At its core, a minimalist reading of that would say that. And so, at the very least, it would seem that the audit committee, as the delegated authority of the city council, would be involved in that selection process, which includes the RFP process. In my
We have to speak into the mics. so-
Yep, sorry.
Well, I think that's, the duties and powers. The primary purpose of the audit committee is to recommend an external auditor to the city council. Now, how much does that implicitly include the RFP process and how much doesn't it? That's where I'd like it's sort of like the Congress when they turn to the parliamentarian and say, we need a ruling here.
And this is part of what I was wanting to say, is that based on last year's pattern, where there was an initial RFP that was frankly deficient, it was then revised thoroughly with Councilor Huda's participation, and I understand that Councilor Huda and Attorney Woodland spent hours, if that's a fair assessment, going over that RFP and revising it and improving it.
But
And it was, and if I may, and it was it was in that spirit that in early December, we continued that effort because this is a sort of a Kaizen approach where bit by bit we try to keep tweaking this to improve it further and further, all with the goal, and we've talked a lot about the ordinance, but the other entity here that's so important is the city charter calling for an independent audit. And what constitutes an independent audit, I think, is also fair game for conversation. But certainly to the extent that city management, and this is why this is such an unusual beast in the structure of the city, but to the extent that city management has an interest, a financial interest in how the audit goes, it brings into question its independence as it is involved with the audit. I had hoped that we'd cover this topic at the end of the meeting, but we're getting into it right now. So, to me, that is the critical point of judgment and discernment, is to the independence of the audit, which is, I think, more important necessarily than the ordinance. The ordinance takes second step to the charter, and to the effect that the ordinance doesn't fully answer the needs of the charter, then it's why we have put into place elements such as the audit committee charter to anticipate that eventually we will evolve to that stage. But in the meantime, I understand that we're not there yet, and the tension that's present is part of what has to get worked out.
And I think that's the maiden voyage nature of this.
And it may take 3 or 4 years to do that.
Let's defer that to later, but I think the powers of the committee are what the council determines them to be, is, I think, the correct legal interpretation, but we'll have to see. We'll have to consult.
And I would just to clarify, I think if you were to talk to Melanson and any of the firms that are doing auditing here in New Hampshire, there has been independence. They would not be able to do their jobs if there wasn't independence. And I know you have a different view in terms of that cautionary note when you have both firms. But I think we should just recognize that there is nothing that has gone, nothing has been unlawful or not independent. It's just, there are different ways to accomplish this task, and if the city council would like to accomplish the task differently, then the city manager, is certainly prepared to work with how the city council would like to go. So I do want to make that point clear, that from the legal perspective, whether you talk to the city attorney, Robert Sullivan, or me wearing my deputy city attorney hat, the city has been in compliance with the charter. And Melanson made it very clear, I know early in those conversations last year, that had they found at any point in time some serious exception, they would have gone straight to the governing body, because that was a conversation that was had. So the fact that an audit committee didn't exist didn't mean that they didn't have the resources and the ability and, frankly, the obligation to go to the governing body if anything rose to the level that required that level of reporting to the governing body. So, like I said, it's up to the city council on how it wants to move forward, and there are different ways to view it and to achieve the end. And, the management will work with whichever direction the city council wants to go on this. But just to clear for the record that we don't think there's been any question in terms of independence or any prior violation of the law or the charter. But that doesn't mean there can't be a different way to go. That's what the council prefers.
Any further comments or on this topic? Because we've gone a little far afield from the purchasing manual.
But the purchasing manual question, it sounds like the train's left the station on that one for this go-around, right?
Correct.
Melanson is going to be doing it.
Well,
So it's,
apparently there's a proposal now that Attorney Woodland has from Melanson. But in the RFP, it indicated that Melanson was the preferred vendor for doing the non-attest services. So,
okay, so you're saying there is, if the city council were to go in a different direction, or wanted to go in a different direction, they still could?
theoretically, because
So-
nothing's been signed, as I understand.
So let me be clear. So right now, what I have before me is a proposal for the non-attest and the other services that they provide as part of the ACFR assistance and preparation. Melanson is not disqualified from proposing on the audit. And so those proposals are due on the 3rd.
Right.
And so whether they will submit a proposal to also do the audit, they are entitled to do so, and that would be then the opportunity for the city council to make the final decision in terms of, do you want a different audit firm, or do you want to use the same firm that is and will be doing the non-attest services? So that's where the nuance comes in. So right now, there's nothing to disqualify Melanson. Now, you may grade them differently when you look at the other proposals, when you apply the criteria. So you may grade them differently, but they are welcome to propose for the audit portion, because they can do it legally and lawfully, so.
Yeah, I welcome their
Yeah.
proposal.
So,
I guess my question was, do we now look at the non-attest process on a go-forward basis and not for this current 2022 year? It's my question. Do we make a recommendation on that, stop that process, or do we move past that process for this year and think about how it might work next year? That's my point.
well, I would suggest that
You
the
know.
non-attest services are beyond the scope
Yeah,
of the audit committee. I think it really comes down to, when you look at the proposals, how you decide to weight any firm, whether it's Melanson or some different firm 5 years from now, if they submit, if the firm that is currently doing the non-attest services is also submitting a proposal for audit services, how you would weight that in your evaluation. Is that a plus or a minus?
Right, I think that's where
Yeah.
where it becomes more complicated, is if they are the provider of the non-attest, how does that affect their candidacy as the auditor?
Yeah.
And we'll have to.
Right, I agree
Yeah.
with that statement. You weigh it
Right.
based on our best judgment,
Right.
but do you stop the non-attest service process in its tracks right now,
Mhm.
is my question? Or do we just go forward and think about how the audit process is going to work, in our view, and report it to the city council? That's kind of my point.
I would be inclined to go forward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
I have a point of clarification there. The non-attest services are not actually part of the audit, is my understanding. They're basically producing reports that aren't technically audited, and they are taking our current financials and altering them so that they can be audited. They're not actually part of the audit. So then I don't fully understand the role of this committee in reviewing non-attest services. So where did we get to the point where the audit committee was looking at non-attest services in addition to the actual audit?
So technically, we're not assigned the role of reviewing the non-attest services, but inasmuch as the vendor that provided the audit services also provided non-attest, it was the committee's view that it would be best to separate those. So in that regard, we wanted to have two separate vendors, if you will, to one for non-attest and one for audit. And whomever since we haven't been tasked with selecting the non-attest, in the December 15 meeting, the RFP that we had put together actually sought proposals for non-attest separate from the auditing, as a way to try to accomplish that. And that was, for better or for worse, that was our effort to try to separate these two roles.
So as a follow-up, the committee's not technically requesting a role in choosing an audit or a firm to do non-attest services. We're just acknowledging that there is a firm doing non-attest services as a committee, and we're making recommendations on the audit
Correct.
firm. Okay.
Right. Okay. So, number 6 on the agenda, proposed work session material for the city council. And I sent around, let me see, a draft on that. To all of you. I think, do I have enough there? Are there 4 copies there?
I have one here.
I've got
You
one.
have-
I've actually got one too.
Okay.
So somehow I missed that.
So, and in full disclosure, I had a meeting with the mayor on Friday to discuss his support of the audit committee and what it is we're trying to do. He certainly, we know his position in terms of the his support of the ordinance and the strict reading of that last, or next to last sentence. But this is written from the point of view of the Audit Committee, and describes, on page 6, you'll see the different views outlined. And in writing this, I tried to be as neutral as I could, but I also wanted to have you be clear in terms of where the Audit Committee has come from in terms of the view of our broader responsibilities. So there's a tension there, and it's an important tension, not one to be swept under the rug. And on page 7, we reiterate the request that I made at the ACFR hearing, where we're seeking the City Council to please fix the various restrictions that have been placed on the Audit Committee. And most specifically, and Attorney Woodland, I call your attention to this point because it's not really in the text, but I can foresee, and Mayor McEachern repeatedly said that he is happy to support the committee's recommendations regarding the auditor, but he said we had to work hard to prove that we had done the work. Now, I'm not sure exactly how we prove that to him. I told him that I was happy to work 50 and 60-hour weeks when I was employed, so I enjoy working hard. But I also can easily see that we will need to speak with the proposer as we get into the weeds with doing this due diligence during the week following February 3rd. And there is a very specific restriction in terms of our not being able to speak with the auditor or any of the proposers. And so I seek especially a waiver on that restriction when it comes time for us to review the proposals, so that we can follow through on working hard to make sure that our due diligence is adequate and complete.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, I think you were interpreting my suggestion, recommendation not to talk to individual audit firms once the RFP was out on the street, as being perhaps broader than I intended. So that, don't speak to audit firms was related to that while the proposal is out on the street and while we're waiting for proposals to come in, because as I explained, when there are questions, we always want to make sure that everyone has the same answers and we post them as addendums. I do anticipate that as this committee evaluates the proposals and narrows down the firm or firms in which there is interest in making a recommendation, that the committee will then decide whether it wants to interview one or more of the audit firms in a confidential session. So I hope that clarifies things, because I certainly understand that this committee is going to be looking at the proposals. It's just we'll want to make sure we do any of that carefully and in accordance with our, established practices for ensuring confidentiality of these types of things, and a process that the whole committee is involved in now that we have our additional members. So does that help clarify that?
It does. I certainly took what you had told me as being more than a suggestion, but be that as it may, I appreciate the latitude you're giving the committee in terms of our ability to have conversations with the proposers. That's very helpful. Yep.
I would just say, if there are going to be any conversations, they just can't be ad hoc, one-off by you or any other member of the committee. It would need to be a formal interview that is done in a process with the whole committee. So I think that's what we're trying to do, is make sure that we follow those types of procedures that we would do for any RFP process to ensure the integrity of the of the procurement process, if you will.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I certainly understand that. We don't want to contaminate the process, so.
Yeah, so,
I think that's a good place for it to end up. I was just going to say, the assistant mayor and a number of others, when the ordinance was in discussion, thought that maybe the best way for the council to exercise its role selecting the auditor was to have those interviews teed up and whole council be part of that. And that's something we still consider if it were scheduled, for half-hour interviews for 2 firms or hour and a half for 3 firms and bang, bang, bang. There was a considerable sentiment that the council has let too much of that responsibility go, and we might want to take that back.
I would welcome that. I think that would be an important step to take. So, the mayor, when I met with him on Friday, outlined tentatively and subject to all sorts of potential revisions, the possibility of having 2, quote, work sessions between the audit committee and the council. The first would be non-public and would discuss the selection process that we went through and the decisions that the audit committee made, so that again, it would be non-public because we're discussing the potential hire of a vendor. And so I envision asking the mayor for permission to share this document with the rest of the council, just as a way of laying the foundation for the conversation, and that the rest of the city council, and I know that there's a wide variety of financial literacy on the council, to try to, and this document is meant in part to address that, to try to bring everyone up to the same level, and have that be part of the non-public conversation. And then the second work session, if you will, in quotes, would be to have a public session once the city council decides on the auditor, where the public is invited and can raise questions or concerns once the auditor is selected.
Well, that's kind of shows where the runway is to land the plane. I like that.
I'm sorry?
That shows where the runway is to land the plane.
Yeah.
A non-public session where you would make your recommendations,
Mm-hmm.
and a public session where we would.
Right. And so I think that these telephone interviews, if they occur, would probably be before that non-public, because we're still in the process of making a decision as to reducing, or, let's say we're fortunate enough to have, say, 4 proposals. It doesn't make any sense to have a non-public conversation still hashing through all 4 candidates. Hopefully by then we're down to 1 or 2. But the phone conversations could easily be part of trying to talk to all 4 if we wish. And then after that's done, and having it done with the city council is fine, and getting their input. And then we would reduce our recommendation down to 1 or 2, is sort of how I envision this happening.
yeah, I think certainly a lot will depend on how many proposals we get.
Right.
And whether you've got a small pool that's easy to work with and they all look relatively qualified, and then you're trying to narrow it down, or whether you've got, a bigger pool and, 3 out of the 7 drop out, and then you get your 4 that you begin to noodle over. Or you may have two that rise right to the top, and it becomes easy, and you decide, do you do it once in terms of an interview with them, or do you do it twice? So maybe once altogether. It depends what the city council wants to do. I will say, just keep in mind, the city council will have a huge volume of work and night meetings in the next, 4 months until we get through budget. So I would use your time with the city council judiciously, because there's a lot coming down the pike in the next 4 months because of the budget. So that when you think about rolling out a Audit 101, there's whatever that you wanted to do, the second public section, that may be something you do after the budget's done and there's a little more spaciousness in the schedule. Obviously, it'll be up to the mayor and the city council in terms of scheduling, but I just put that out there that there's a lot coming, so I'd be, very cognizant of trying to use their time wisely. So.
So if I could ask a question on that. So
Please.
auditor selection is job number one, it seems like.
Right.
And that's what we're going to use our time early with the city council. What is the timeline on getting that papered typically is my first question.
In terms of getting it under contract? We'll want to do that as soon as possible, because if it is a new audit firm, they are going to need more time to, I think, kind of set up, so to speak,
Okay.
To kind of begin to think about how they're going to approach doing our work if they're a brand-new firm. So we're going to have to try and, that will, when I look at contracts or when we divvy out work, it's like, okay, what needs to move quickly and what can wait until there's a quieter moment. So
Okay.
this will be one on the hot track.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I guess my second question, because we have limited airtime with the city council, but we do have, after we get through that process, assuming we all agree, and I don't want to muddy the waters too much, but the next questions are kind of the maiden voyage questions. Are we involved with that contract papering? And then after that, what communication is coming from the auditor back to the city council via the audit committee or directly? So do we pose questions to the city council saying, what's your recommendation on road forward? Is this committee included on communications with the city manager from the auditor? Is that the oversight? That's one potential solution. But I think we need those questions posed to the city council, hopefully with a recommendation for us, just on the rules of the road.
Yep.
Communication and reporting, if there, for some reason, was any issue, how do they want us to operate going forward?
If you like, since you kind of have just arrived.
Yep.
So some of the changes that I made in the sort of draft RFP that this committee put together in the fall, and the one that's issued basically limits, if you will, I don't want to say limits, it's not quite the word, but typically, or under the ordinance as it's written now, the only time the auditor is going to be reaching out to the audit committee is if there is a major or substantial exception. I forget the word exactly that's used. So the audit committee does not have an ongoing role. So makes a recommendation to the city council, and then you're done. You guys get to kind of rest.
Yeah.
Then it falls to the auditor, city staff to work with the auditor. That process moves forward. So we get it under contract, the audit happens, and then there's a report out, January, like we did. Here are the results of the audit, and that's assuming there's no major exception. If there's a major exception, then it comes to the audit committee to help the city council decide how to deal with the situation. So that is the current structure of the ordinance. So that is why right now, there is no anticipation that the audit committee is going to see a draft of the contract, is going to be having regular contact with the auditor. That's going to happen as it's happened for the last 20 years, which is you get it under contract, it gets done, and there's a report out at the end of the year.
Right. That's great. It seems like that's the point of tension that we're trying to solve for.
Right.
Right. So, and what's embedded in that ordinance, implicit in that ordinance, and how does the city council want to set the rules going forward? And it seems like the city council is the authority to decide that.
Yes.
So that's why I'm saying I think
Yeah, we are,
to get some clarity there.
we are creatures of the city council, so, but I think that again, it depends on the definition of the selection process, and that there could be major stumbling blocks in the contract, or there may be issues that the audit committee wants to make sure that if we're not involved in the negotiation of the contract, that we want to flag to Attorney Woodland that she take special care to address some issues that we, even though we selected Auditor XYZ, that there's still some issues that we want to make sure that she's aware of that get addressed in the contract. And I would hope that you'd be open to our communicating that to you as part of trying to, not unlike what we did last June, as you and we were working with Melanson to try to improve that contract writing process. So I hope that would be an acceptable arrangement.
I do think, is ultimately a decision of the city council in terms of if they don't find that there's sufficient specificity. I think what you will find is what you found this fall, which is in the absence of specificity, I was happy to come and participate in these meetings and to hear suggestions, just recognizing that the final decision in terms of what goes into the RFP, the final decision of what goes into the contract gets made by management. But I think there's, as I've said before, and as you know, when we've had some back and forth, which is, if there's a good idea, I am not one to walk away from it. And I think that is generally true across the board. That being said, it's a question of who's making the final call, and are these really suggestions and recommendations in the best interest of the city? And of course, we have that boundary of the ordinance. And so it's,
Yeah.
so I think that's what I can add to that.
Mr. Chairman.
Yep.
I think Jesse asked a question that got right to the crux of it. After you recommend to the council the choice of auditor, then the process goes forward. Well, how do you make sure it's independent? Once again, the charter says that the auditor reports to the city council. So that firm, assuming they're professionals, is going to say, we need to show the city council the shape of the books. Are they clean? Is this the thin letter, or is this the thick letter? And you always want the thin letter with an audit. But I think there's plenty of independence there. And having been through the process of the council as a legislative body making up its mind about the process, the final ordinance does not have any language about the audit committee staying involved with the audit process. The council assumes an independent auditor knows its business and will report to us.
I think that's correct, and that's what we heard from Melanson, which is if something is serious enough in terms of what they find, then it's going up to the governing body. And then, your day-to-day city staff uploads a lot of information on secure websites to the auditors. The auditors come, they go through the files, they ask lots of questions, and they do their testing. And all staff, as requested, participates in responding to the auditors. And that's how the process has been, moving along. It's how it gets done, and it gets done and has been done successfully without a lot of intervention from a third party. But the auditors are very clear. If there's something that they feel needs to be brought to the governing body, it will come to the governing body, because that is their obligation.
And, Mr. Chairman, if that happens, then the audit committee, per the language of the ordinance, swings back into action and helps us, through your financial expertise, understand what the auditors are saying.
It may take us some time to get back up to speed because we haven't been involved with the audit, nor have you. But we certainly stand ready to be of service in that regard.
We assume your financially quizzes and quick studies.
You're very kind, Counselor. Good. So then, number 7 is the pension funding status matter, and that, I sent around a report.
I feel like I did not see this, so
I'm
I don't
sorry.
know whether I missed an email, which is certainly
Also-
possible.
I will, let me give you a quick summary of this. Petra, did you get a
You got enough?
copy?
I've got one.
You're all
Thank
set.
you very much.
Yep.
We're all set. So this was, this research was done as a way to step off from the ACFR hearing, and where Councilor Tabor asked an excellent question regarding the funding status of the pension plan. And frankly, between us chickens, I was rather disappointed with the auditor's response. Because I think that there's a lot more here than just talking about the discount rate, and there was some confusion about what the discount rate is. There are really two numbers that are key. One is the assumed rate of return on investments, and the second is the discount rate, which is getting to the net present value of a future stream of cash flows. In this case, the obligations that stretch out ad infinitum on the pensions. And frankly, this is not a financial term, but it really bugged me that the discount rate and the assumed rate of return on investments are used by the New Hampshire retirement system as being the same number, because they really shouldn't be. And there was a great discussion in the attached article, and Attorney Woodland, that's the link in the bottom, and I'll send this to you electronically so you can tap onto it.
Thanks.
But in essence, that discount rate would be high if you were very uncertain about that future stream, because then the weighted probability would be of the future, of the present value would be lower. But in point of fact, I would say that it's pretty unrisky, that future stream of obligations. Those are pretty well known. And therefore, that discount rate should probably be much lower than the 6.75% number that the state uses. The 6.7% assumed investment return, is probably not too far off. It could even be 7%, as 80% invest in equities. So that's a pretty reasonable number. I mean, Jesse, you will.
After last year, it should be lower.
That's right. That's right. And that was the point I made at the end of this, is that given the robust returns we've had over the last few years, it's wise for them to be ratcheting that down. So it's really the discount rate that concerns me. And the opinion piece that it was attached was from a guy at Princeton. He was writing about the New Jersey retirement system, which we can well imagine Jersey being Jersey is perhaps a little dicier than New Hampshire. But this is recorded, I should be careful. But nevertheless, the higher the discount rate, the lower the present value, because the discount rate appears in the denominator of the calculation, which means that the obligations are lower, and for an underfunded pension, that's attractive because it means that your obligations are lower, and it makes it easier for you to meet those calculated obligations. But in fact, you run the risk that you're skating on thin ice, and you should be cognizant of the fact that you're that even more underfunded than you are. And that's where I ended up as I did my research, is that I'm concerned, and we're not the only one because in New Hampshire, because all the municipalities participate in this retirement system. I think the trustees recognize the issue. But so I think the question, and I would love to be able to pose this to the trustees, is okay, so you're only funded at, say, 64% of the 100% obligation, and in fact that 64% is of an understated amount. How do you suggest that we better ensure that we can meet our future obligations? And I don't know the answer to that. I can think of some solutions, but I would rather have the state come back and guide us and try to develop some sort of policy that might better secure the retirement futures of our current and past employees.
I knew Dick Ingram, who ran the state pension fund for a number of years, and it's in better shape now than it was.
Yes, indeed. I would grant, they have come light years from where they were.
Yes, Suzanne.
Okay.
Oh,
Sorry.
No, I thought you.
Yeah, no, I did. So the city has no control over that discount rate. That's set by the New Hampshire retirement system. So the question might be, is this something you might want to raise with the, sort of kind of falls under the legislative subcommittee, as to whether to approach the New Hampshire Retirement System Board and speak, on behalf of the city, and so I think that is where that concern and question might go next, because if the legislative subcommittee, looks at that and says, yes, we would like to have someone from the city, such as yourself, weigh in on this topic, then there is an avenue for that voice to be heard, shall we say, at the New Hampshire Retirement System Board. And I think that would be the good process for you to take that concern and those questions and thoughts and run it through the subcommittee. And if they're good with that, then, it will have a venue where your opinion and your thoughts on this could be heard.
Good.
Does
Thank
that
you.
work? Yeah.
Yeah, and Councilor Cook and I are both on the legislative subcommittee.
Oh, how convenient.
How convenient.
Okay.
I forgot.
The amount the state has funded the pension program continues to decline. And so I don't think there's an appetite there for the state to shoulder more. And so if more has to be funded, it will come in the future in the form of more downshifting of pension costs. I think
I'm sorry, downshifting.
of pension costs to the cities and towns, and that's,
Oh.
that's what we just have to be wary of, I think.
This is a future planning issue of potential indebtedness that is precisely what I'm wanting to flag.
And I would agree, Mr. Chairman. I'm very concerned about the increases that we're seeing in that area from the state, with the state changing its formulas. And that increase is concerning because ultimately it impacts our taxpayers very
Right.
directly. And if that continues in that same vein, we will end up in a position that we're either raising taxes significantly, which we don't want to do, or we're cutting services. So it is something that we need to absolutely be aware of, and something that needs to be finessed at the State House. And the advantage of taking this to the legislative subcommittee is that we would have our representation there, able to discuss the best means of approaching this and trying to get the state to think about taking on some of the burden versus sending it all to municipalities.
Good. So this was, in my meeting with the mayor on Friday, I mentioned 3 areas that Mr. Furman and Mr. Lynch and I have been thinking about over the last month or so, this being one of them. The second one is the future litigation consent decree issues and the extent to which those represent a future off-balance sheet liability for the city. Some of you may know, I used to work as a hydrogeologist, and so I'm very aware of the Coakley long tail, if you will. But it's an area of concern that we have that will potentially also impact the city's balance sheet. The third area is the one of cybersecurity. Mr. Furman has a particular interest in that, and the ongoing investments in the technology area, which have been increasing, but as we know, the risk of getting hacked only increases year by year. And we had an event recently that the city was hacked.
No, we weren't hacked, but there was a
Incursion.
issue with the system that there was a power surge that triggered a cascade of events at the beginning of January.
Okay.
And the system did not respond as we had expected it to in terms of recovering right away. So there's a series of looks that we're doing as to why that didn't happen.
Did it recover?
We are still in the process of taking care of some issues, and I don't want to have too much conversation about this in a public setting right now, because we're still we're still investigating and exploring. So.
We'd like to get involved in that cybersecurity.
To the extent that we can be helpful,
Exactly.
as it represents there are risks involved, and potential.
Very well aware of those.
Yeah.
Very well aware of those.
So if we can be of assistance in any way.
I think the question goes back to the scope of the audit committee. So if there's I think it depends what you want this committee to be, and that doesn't mean that the city's not interested in taking advantage of the expertise and the interest in these other subjects. I'm just trying to figure out what is the best method or means to make that happen, and is it within the scope of this committee so that it doesn't get conflated with your general duty of audit? Is there another way to find a way to take advantage of this? Obviously, when we talk about litigation, a lot of that is actually done in non-public with the city council when we're looking at those types of issues. So,
Right.
And we do have to disclose certain information to auditors and that kind of stuff. So there is some information that, again, it would not be appropriate for a public discussion. But I think maybe it's a conversation about, other avenues of participation, again, but it's up to the city council and what would
Definitely.
like the scope of this audit committee to be. But, so it's not a no, it's a question of, is there a forum
Yeah.
that would be more appropriate?
And we'd look to city council for guiding us in that regard, whether it's the pension issue or cybersecurity or Coakley.
And I will say, during the budget process, keep in mind that to the extent you see items in the budget, which I can tell you will, related not only on the capital side, but I anticipate you will be seeing on the operations side that looks at IT investments, that's where your support for those investments would be really helpful, because a lot of folks don't understand the back end. And as someone who's spent a lot of time with, Mike Merrill out of Public Works on the SCADA side, and, down with Daisy Lavoie in the police department, it's a big back end. And so frankly, having people understand the importance of that investment would be awesome.
Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
excellent.
So I want to turn our attention to post-February 3rd, because for the audit committee, our world will change dramatically. Our workload will jump up the week of February 7th. What I'm wanting to do, because I have no idea what that workload is going to be at this stage, but I'd like to set aside, if I may, some times that we could meet during that week to, if I could. So yes, Councilor Tabor, it's time to grab our calendars.
That's right.
So starting on the 7th, I just put down 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and having no idea how long these, or whether we're going to need those times or not. But if we could, in pencil, try to set those times aside, maybe for an hour at each time.
I'm sorry, which days were you?
So 7, 8, 9, and 10. What I'd like to do, if we could, is to try to come up with a recommendation by the end of that week, that we could at least then line up these conference calls if they're deemed to be necessary, or a selection to present to City Council.
I'm going to ask a question. So city council meets when? The 17th? Is that-
Meet the 7th and the 22nd.
22nd.
Yeah, so it's the 22nd. And is that Washington's birthday?
It's a
Yes.
Tuesday.
Is it Tuesday?
And then when after that?
First Monday in March. isn't it?
7th.
Yeah, March 7th.
And I guess the follow-up to that is, we're going to have a lot of work to do. And if we're just reviewing it 7th, 8th, 9th, do we, is that enough time to turn it around to then make a recommendation to the city council?
I would be amazed if we could get something to the council by the 22nd of February, especially if it's if it's a squeaker and there are two candidates that we really like. I easily see this going into March.
Okay.
But on the other hand, I'm very much aware that we can't allow ourselves to get too far into the spring either.
Right.
And so,
Just
Yeah.
also on the 22nd, I believe we deliberate and vote the capital improvement plan. We have the
Think so.
public hearing on the 7th, so then
so it's going to be full.
I've got a motion. Oh, I don't know who else has a motion, but it'd be busy.
It will be busy.
So,
Yeah. I do think we would want to get, in the ideal world, a recommendation out of the city council by the 7th would be good, because that will then give us time to get under contract and
March 7th.
March 7th.
Yes.
I'll talk with Judy and see how much wiggle room we have, but obviously sooner it is better, but we might be able to push that off a bit. The 7th is a pretty booked day for me, so it would be hard to move some of the stuff that I've got on the 7th. So my preference would be we start on the 8th and maybe do it for a longer meeting if, rather than trying to fit it into an hour. I think if we're opening proposals, coming up with a spreadsheet, I'll come down with, unless, I don't want to step on anyone's toes here. Typically, someone in advance would take the criteria from the RFP and kind of set them out so everyone's got a handy cheat sheet, and then give some thought as to the scoring mechanisms, because there's more than one way to do it. I know we had the weighting discussion, 75%, 25%, something as I recall. But within that, sometimes it's easier, frankly, when you're looking at the firms and having personally never scored audit firms before. I don't know how you want to do that. Sometimes it's easier not to get into the weeds with 10 points for this and 5 points for that, as opposed to, here's this bucket. This looks like about a 65 out of 75 based on everything, and this looks like a 20 out of 25. Sometimes it's easier to stay in the bigger pieces, almost like you grade A, B, C, or you can kind of rank roughly. So it sometimes helps to see how many you have and kind of what the quality looks like, and then decide what's the best number for then doing the best strategy for the deep dive, because some people have preferred methods, and I don't have a fixed view on that, and would be more than willing to help you as a committee figure out what's going to work best for you in evaluating those proposals based on the criteria that were issued.
So what I imagine, if we start on the 8th at 1 o'clock and ask that we meet for a 2-hour session, say from 1 to 3, if that is a possibility, then what I imagine will happen is that we'll open the packages. Let's say there are 3 proposals, and I think that can we get a whiteboard? Oh, there is a whiteboard.
Yep, exactly. That's why this is a great room if it's available, because.
Yeah. I imagine that of, say, the 3, one will, 2 will rise to the top quickly. I'm just guessing. Who knows? And the 3rd will have some deficiencies in it, or there'll be problems with it. And but then we need to begin to drill down. And so perhaps for that, the second hour, we're getting back down into the weeds. But the first hour is really looking at the proposals and coming up with our scheme for how we're going to tackle the rating project. But to that end, I would ask that you please take a look at the RFP, and I sent links out, I think.
Yep.
Yes.
Starting at page 11 is the request requirements, and then page 15 goes into the actual details. So please spend some time with that material and imagine how you would tackle this. Yeah.
In the end, a perhaps more time-efficient method, when we evaluate the city manager, the council, we could ask staff to develop a matrix. We could all get copies of the proposals and read them. We could each score the proposals and then come to the meeting to deliberate on our scores.
Mm-hmm.
We have done it that way
Yeah.
for other committees.
So if they're all due by 2 o'clock on the 3rd, which is a Thursday, how quickly would you be able to turn the material around and get that to us?
I would expect that we could do that by Friday, because it's really just opening and getting them in a form. Trying to think the best form. I'm not always keen on emailing, but you guys don't have iPads. But you two do. All right, let me think. We'll find out the best form, and if there's a preference for a paper copy, we could probably make that available if you'd prefer paper as opposed to electronic. And we might push yours out on the iPad, or maybe not. The other option is sometimes we use a flash drive, because then you can return the flash drive afterwards.
I mean, I'd prefer the iPad just because
Yeah,
it's searchable.
yeah. Because we send you guys stuff confidentially on the iPad, because it gets wiped. Yeah, so I'm sure we could get that out by Friday, assuming there aren't too many, so. you know.
Okay. So following Counselor Tabor's suggestion then, so when we sit down on the 8th, which is a Tuesday, we should be ready to dig in.
So I guess what you might want to then decide about taking the time here, if you're going to take an initial look at them, you could do one of two things. If you want to adopt a scoring structure now, knowing you're going to, even if you stick with the big buckets of the categories, there's some that's like the 75% weighted and then the 25% weighted. You know, if you want to kind of talk about that now, so that as you're all looking at them for the first time, you already have that structure in your mind, or if you want to just read them in advance and then just so you're familiar with them, and then decide a more rigorous scoring structure and actually score them while you're here. Sometimes it's interesting to hear other people's comments, frankly.
I think that's the best way to do it.
That's how we've often done it, because, you know, one engineer may be reading from one perspective and someone else might be reading from another perspective, you know, and like I said, there's no one way to do it. You just have to document the way you did it and stick with the criteria in the RFP. But within that, there's some shades of how the committee or group best looks at and tries to get to the answer of what's in the best interest of the city. So I can do that either way. You can just get them and just at least have read them beforehand, and if that's all you want to do, and then when we sit on the 8th, you kind of figure out the more formal scoring method, but at least now you've seen them, you're familiar with the layout, and if that works for you, that's fine, or if you want to talk about it now more, that's fine too.
I'd like written, I would like to pick them up here whenever, just so I have them,
In writing,
yeah.
hard copy.
Hard copy.
I know my inclination is to do the hashing out here together, because I agree with you, Attorney Woodland, that you know, there will be a synergistic effect as we begin to delve in and put our minds together on this, that we'll learn from someone else's comments that, oh, gee, we should really be looking at that.
That's what I've found in some cases, it's that synergy. I will tell you, in Florida, it's different. You're not allowed to talk to anyone during the first round of scoring. New Hampshire has some flexibility in terms of how you do that, and
Well, there are many attributes to Florida, but I think we'll do better
I
there, so.
as someone who briefly toyed with whether to earn more money down in Florida, I thought, you know, I just don't like the way the structures work there. I don't think they actually work as effectively as New Hampshire, somewhat simpler, you know, working more directly. So you're still
Is that
stuck with me,
acceptable?
sorry.
Is that acceptable to all of you?
Should be fine.
Yeah, I think it should be fine.
Okay. Jesse, are you okay with
Yep,
that?
that sounds like a good plan.
Okay, so at least you'll be able to read them in advance and kind of get a sense of what you're working with.
Would it
And then-
be helpful, Mr. Chairman, to have staff come up with a draft matrix?
They certainly can.
We could list them all on the, list every proposer on the side, and what we would typically do is make sure that they provided everything. In this case, it's just a proposal, but I forget, I didn't bring my copy down. You know, did they address this? Sometimes we just do a checkbox. So they met the minimum requirements because they gave you everything. And then there's a blank score sheet for you to kind of develop and then implement.
I think that'd be helpful.
It's sometimes nice just to see the whole list and know that we took a quick look to see, yes,
Yeah,
they,
that would be helpful.
Just
they,
to-
they are actually licensed to do work here in, you know, New Hampshire. You would be surprised how sometimes you'll get stuff, proposals from California or, you know, some company that doesn't actually read carefully to see. In which case, it's very easy because you set that one aside. You
Right.
don't look at it once it doesn't meet one of those very significant criteria. But you
there
can
other-
see it on the list, so you know, and there's no checkbox next to that requirement.
Are there other issues that you'd like to ask of staff?
No, I think that,
So that would be helpful.
Okay, we'll get that together.
Thank you.
So,
Okay, good. So the last item beside, well, we've got public comments, but other business. Counselor Tabor, do you, and Cook, do you feel as if we've hashed over these issues embedded in our meeting discussion, or are there other points that you'd like to?
I think we've had a good back and forth about them, and I think that's been productive because we have outlined the next steps based on that discussion.
Right.
I think my concern is that the charter, which came from the December 15th meeting, you know, how does that square with the ordinance that's written? And I would refer that to the legal staff as a sort of parliamentary inquiry, because I wouldn't want us to begin talking to auditors, for example, in our selection interviews, giving the impression that we're going to be doing more things with that auditor than is in the scope of the ordinance.
I can bring to the next meeting a report of kind of legal's perspective on the charter versus the ordinance.
I think speaking as a counselor, you know, at the council level, we would want to know that the audit committee's scope of work was clearly defined and agreed to going forward.
And so it sounds that would be helpful, having Attorney Woodland's input, but it seems there's still that tension in my view that the city council needs to put those parameters around it, right? It's an interpretation.
Well, the question is, hasn't the council already said what it wants in the ordinance? Because I don't know when you joined the committee, Jesse, but we worked on that from July through December.
It was a
Yeah.
while.
It went through numerous iterations, and what you were watching was the legislative body make up its mind. So if it's made up its mind, what does the language of that ordinance mean?
Yeah, the council rules.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was not involved. I just came right at the end of the year, so after the charter was accepted. But
Right.
and so I don't have the benefit of that discussion.
This is the July 12th version. This
Right.
is the letter from legal, August 17th. This is the August 3rd version. Then we got finally to
The actual ordinance that passed, yeah.
the actual ordinance that passed.
So my only other comment there would be that the city council appears to have, made their decision after lots of deliberation and discussion. But we're looking at the ordinance, and there still seems to be some tension on what that actually means in practice for the audit committee, which is a subgroup of them in terms of having communication with the auditor, if any. And maybe it's a straight no from the city council, and that's fine, it puts it to bed. And any reporting from the auditor up to the audit committee as a body of the city council. And I think it would be great if we could, and maybe I'm missing it, but it seems like that one extra step will kind of lay out the rules of the road for the committee in terms of.
The whole idea is we're trying to help.
And,
That's all.
and we, invite your help and your expertise. We want to do that. But there were numerous points of view on the council, ranging from the council should select the auditor as a committee of the whole, to the audit committee should be only members of the council, to the audit committee should be, first it was 1, then it was 2, there was discussion of 3 counselors and how many outside citizens. So it went through quite a process. And there were arguments, valid arguments on all sides. The original, with very broad oversight, did not get enough votes to pass. The modified version that you have now did get enough votes strongly. So that's the legislative process,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to add to that a little bit. I think that, it is such a process at the city council level, going through all of this decision-making around parsing words in any ordinance, that I think it's reasonable here to ask legal for an opinion and to get an opinion from legal, because that's going to be much faster than going back to the council and asking for an opinion, because then the council will have to deliberate. It might end up going to a committee, and for a committee deliberation. So you're not going to get a clear answer very quickly, likely from the council, especially right now when the council's going to be doing so much budget work this spring. So probably the fastest venue for getting an opinion is to go to legal and ask for an opinion. And then if we're not satisfied as a committee with that opinion, then going to the council and asking for an opinion.
So I'll bring something to the next meeting. How's that?
Okay.
Like a little breakdown, I can just make it clear.
Yep.
Yeah, I think as the city attorney has often said, policy runs in the direction it was set until the policymakers vote differently.
Okay, thank you. So that's the other business. Public comment. Please.
Petra Huda, 280 South Street, Portsmouth. In sitting here listening to all the conversation and the discussion, I might be able to clarify some things and some of the intent that was put forward since I started this whole mess. I don't know how else to describe it.
And worked very hard on it.
Worked very hard.
So I guess for the benefit of the new counselors, the original intent, obviously, is to getting back into compliance with the charter, section 7.4, and that means the biggest thing that was stressed during this whole discussion was independence. And in accounting, in finance, what independence means in an audit is that the auditor does not report to the people that they are auditing. And that is the biggest stumbling block here that I see, still trying to understand what the purpose and what the, I guess the sections are between the non-attest and the regular audit. So the first thing that I'd like to kind of put out there for the non-attest services, so maybe to help you clarify, is the reason we have to have the non-attest services is because for the last 25 years and ongoing, and this is standard in New Hampshire, the staffs are not equipped to take the financials of the city with all their different complexities and put them into a package that you would hand to an auditor. So basically, the auditor in a non-attest service is finishing the job to get it to the point, the financials to a point where they can be audited. So I hope that helps. The other reference I would ask you to look at is, it is true that the council makes policy, and the part of it is look at what the charter says and look at what the admin policies say, because I think there's some confusion and some going back and forth about what the duties are, especially with the RFP, especially with the contract of what is the job of the audit committee and what they can do with the authority that they've been given, and how to get there. As far as the audit committee's assignment in the ordinance, it's one of those things where you just don't pop out a recommendation. You have to follow the process through. And looking at and listening to how I commend your process of how you're going to look at this. It's a lot of the stuff from an accounting perspective is clearly defined in your RFP, which from my perspective, that should be the easy part. But it also tells you that how the separations of duties to maintain your independence will go. So as far as how much the staff has to do with that and how much the audit committee has to do with that, there should be a mingling of efforts here to get to the point where you can give an answer to the policymakers. And on that, I would totally agree with City.
Pick a hat.
Yeah, pick a hat.
Suzanne.
That it's good. The council is going to be very busy, and I would suggest, from past experience, that if you are going to meet to discuss this with the council and explain your position, I think what Chairman White came up with as far as an explanation and where you are would be a good starting point, and then come in with your suggestions to kind of condense the time that you need to get in front of the council, because they'll have a zillion other things to do. And I do honestly believe that this committee can come up with a good suggestion with the expertise that is on here. And you could do it in a condensed version. I guess the only other thing that I'd like to suggest is still consider at the end of this how much independence you are maintaining with the audit committee not being involved. When Councilor Tabor says that, yeah, if we have a problem, they're going to come back to you, the break of independence there is that it will go to the staff first. So, and that shouldn't be, that's where your problem lies, because if the auditor this is my experience, if the auditor does find something, you will never know as an audit committee or staff, because staff will review it first. This is not to say there's anything wrong, and I do want to touch on one thing that Suzanne said, and the thing that Melanson has been doing this, and the suggestion is they're doing something illegal. That is never the suggestion. Basically, it was impossible. So that is not the purpose of the audit committee, and there was never any suggestion that anybody did anything illegal or they were going down that path. So I kind of want to put that to bed. I guess those are my comments. If you have any questions for me or anything that of what the original intent was, I know Jesse wasn't here through all of the other stuff. So I'm happy to answer, and I'm available for your comments. Thank you.
Do you want to take questions now?
Well, if you have any.
If there are
Anybody? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments, questions, concerns? It's not quite time to go to the Clipper, but, so if I could get a motion to adjourn, please.
I move we adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right,
Thank you very much.
thank you.